I've debated whether to share this for months now. Part of me is convinced that putting it into words will only solidify it, make it more real. But I haven't been able to sleep since it happened. Maybe writing it down will help me make sense of it, or at least convince me that I'm not losing my mind. Last winter, my friend Mark invited me up to his family's cabin in the North Woods of Minnesota. It wasn't the kind of cabin you'd imagine from movies. No roaring fireplace, no cozy plaid blankets. It was a small, weathered structure with peeling paint and a roof that sagged under the weight of the snow. The place had been in Mark's family for decades, but no one really used it anymore. Good for ice fishing, he'd said, which was all I needed to hear. We drove up late on a Friday. The highway gave way to narrower and narrower roads until we were bumping along a snow-covered trail in the middle of nowhere. The cabin stood at the edge of a frozen lake, surrounded by skeletal trees whose bare branches clawed at the sky. It was beautiful, in a stark, unforgiving way. The first night was uneventful. We cracked open some beers, unpacked our gear, and set up our ice fishing equipment. I remember thinking how quiet it was. No cars, no voices, just the sound of the wind sifting through the trees. But the quiet didn't last. It started with a sound. We were out on the lake the next morning, sitting in camp chairs over the holes we drilled into the ice. The fish weren't biting, but neither of us cared. It was enough just to be there, breathing in the sharp, cold air. Then I heard it. At first, I thought it was the wind, a low, mournful howl that echoed across the lake. But it didn't rise or fall like wind usually does. It held steady, a long, keening wail that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Did you hear that?" I asked Mark. He nodded, his face pale beneath his wool hat. "Coyotes," he said, but he didn't sound convinced. The sound came again that night. We were inside, huddled around the stove that barely managed to keep the place warm. This time it was louder, closer. "It's just the wind," Mark said, but his eyes kept darting to the windows. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept waking up to that sound, a low, guttural moan that seemed to vibrate through the walls. Once, I thought I heard footsteps crunching through the snow outside, but when I peeked through the curtains, there was nothing but darkness. The third day is when everything fell apart. We decided to hike through the woods to break up the monotony. Mark knew the area well and said there was an old trapper's cabin a few miles away that might be worth checking out. The forest was dense, the trees so tightly packed that they blocked out most of the daylight. About halfway through the hike, we found tracks in the snow. They were huge, much too big to be a deer's, and shaped wrong for a bear. The prints had long, spindly toes that ended in sharp points, like claws. Maybe a wolf? Mark suggested, though he didn't sound sure. They weren't spaced like a four-legged animal's. It looked like whatever had made them was walking on two legs. We made it to the trapper's cabin just as the sun was setting. The place was a ruin, half collapsed, with moss-covered beams and a rusted stove. Inside, it smelled of mildew and rot. That's when we heard it again, the howl. But this time it was so close it made my chest vibrate. Mark and I froze, staring at each other, and then at the open doorway of the cabin. The sound came again, a long, shuddering moan that rose into a high-pitched shriek before cutting off abruptly. And then came the footsteps. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Whatever it was walking through the snow just outside. Mark grabbed a rusted poker from the stove and motioned for me to stay quiet. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. The footsteps stopped just outside the doorway. I don't know how to describe what I saw next. It was tall, easily 7 or 8 feet, and impossibly thin. Its limbs stretched out like they didn't belong to a human body. Its skin was gray, stretched tight over sharp bones, and its face was the worst part. It looked like a deer's skull, But the eye sockets weren't empty. There were eyes in there, small and black, glinting like polished stones. It opened its mouth, too wide, the jaw unhinging like a snake's, and let out that same wailing scream that had haunted us for days. I don't remember running. I just remember the terror, the icy burn in my lungs as I sprinted through the snow, Mark right behind me. The trees blurred together, their branches whipping at my face, but I didn't stop. When we slammed the door shut and pushed the table against it. We didn't talk, didn't even look at each other. We just sat there in the dark, listening. The sound came again, circling now. Slow, deliberate footsteps crunched through the snow, followed by that awful, keening wail. We stayed awake all night, clutching the poker and a hunting knife we'd found in a drawer. The footsteps never stopped. At first, they were slow and steady. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The sound of snow compacting beneath something heavy. Mark sat by the window, his breath fogging the glass as he tried to peer through the frost. I stayed near the door, my back pressed against the table we'd shoved against it, every muscle in my body coiled tight. Is it circling us? I whispered. Mark didn't answer, but I saw him nod. His face was pale, his lips pressed into a thin line. Then, as if to confirm my fear, the footsteps shifted. They moved from the side to the front, stopping just beyond the door. We froze. There was a long silence, broken only by the crackle of the wood stove and the faint whistle of wind through the gaps in the walls. My fingers ached from gripping the knife too tightly, but I didn't dare loosen my hold. Then came the scratching. It started soft, almost tentative, long, deliberate drags of something sharp across the wood. My skin crawled at the sound, and I had to clench my teeth to keep from crying out. Mark turned to me, his eyes wide, and mouthed something I couldn't make out. The scratching grew louder, more insistent. Whatever was out there wasn't in a hurry. It was testing us, playing with us. Should we make a run for it? Mark whispered finally, his voice barely audible over the sound. To where? I shot back. The nearest road was miles away, and even if we could reach the car, we'd have to dig it out of the snow first. No, we were trapped. The scratching stopped suddenly, and for a moment the silence was worse. I strained to listen, my ears ringing from the effort, but all I could hear was the pounding of my own heartbeat. Then came the thud. It hit the roof hard enough to shake snow from the edges. A heavy, bone-jarring impact that made me jump to my feet. Mark stumbled back from the window, his chair scraping against the floor. "It's on the roof," he whispered, his voice trembling. We stared at the ceiling, half expecting it to cave in under the weight of whatever was up there. The sound of footsteps resumed, slow and deliberate, but this time they came from above. Thump, thump, thump. The roof creaked under each step, the beams groaning as if protesting the strain. Mark grabbed my arm, his grip tight enough to bruise. "What do we do?" he hissed. I didn't have an answer. My mind raced, cycling through half-formed plans and discarded ideas. My hands were slick with sweat despite the cold, and my legs felt like they might give out at any second. The footsteps stopped directly above us, and then it spoke. At least, I think it spoke. The sound was like nothing I'd ever heard. Low and guttural, a series of clicks and growls that sent shivers down my spine. It wasn't human, but there was something disturbingly deliberate about it, as if it were trying to mimic speech. Mark made a strangled noise, somewhere between a gasp and a sob. I wanted to tell him to keep quiet, but my throat had closed up. The clicking stopped, replaced by a long, low exhale. It was so close I could feel it in my chest, a deep, resonant hum that made my skin prickle. Then came the knock. 3 sharp raps on the roof, as if it were knocking to be let in. I don't know what broke first, Mark's nerves or mine. Mark grabbed his bag and made for the door. The cold hit me like a slap as we stumbled out into the snow. The sky was starting to lighten, the first hints of dawn breaking through the trees, but it did little to dispel the oppressive darkness. We ran. I didn't look back, not even when I heard the roof creak again, followed by a heavy thud as something dropped to the ground behind us. I could hear it following, the crunch of its footsteps faster now, more erratic. The trees closed in around us, their branches snagging at our clothes as we stumbled through the snow. My lungs burned, each breath coming in short, ragged gasps, but I didn't dare slow down. The sound was getting closer. It wasn't just footsteps now. There was that awful clicking again, louder and more frantic, like it was laughing. I could feel it closing in, the space between us shrinking with every step. My legs felt like they were moving through molasses, each stride slower than the last. The snow clung to my boots, weighing me down, and the cold bit into my chest with every ragged breath. Mark was a few paces ahead, his silhouette barely visible against the faint gray of the approaching dawn. I knew it was already following, and I knew it was close. Too close. The clicking stopped suddenly, and for one horrible moment so did I. My ears strained to pick up any sound, but there was nothing. No footsteps, no wind, just an oppressive, suffocating silence. And then, from somewhere off to my left, I heard the crunch of snow. I turned my head, my heart hammering in my chest, and caught a glimpse of it through the trees. It was moving parallel to me, its long, skeletal limbs weaving through the branches with unnatural ease. Its head turned toward me, the empty black eyes locking onto mine, and I felt an icy jolt of terror that rooted me to the spot. Smiled. At least, I think it was a smile. Its jaw unhinged slightly, the sharp teeth glinting in the dim light, and the clicking started again. Faster, more chaotic, like a grotesque parody of laughter. "Run!" Mark's voice snapped me out of my trance, and I forced my legs to move. I didn't look back again. Couldn't. The trees thinned suddenly, and I stumbled into a small clearing. Mark was waiting on the other side, waving frantically for me to hurry. The car was just beyond him, a dark shape against the pale snow, and for a brief, fleeting moment, I thought we might actually make it. But then the sound came again. Not the clicking this time. No, this was worse. It was a scream. A long, piercing wail that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It wasn't human, but there was something painfully familiar about it, like the distorted cry of someone in agony. My knees nearly buckled at the sound. Mark was shouting something, but I couldn't make out the words. He grabbed my arm, pulling me forward, and together we sprinted toward the car. The scream cut off abruptly, and the sudden silence was almost worse. I didn't see it coming. One moment I was running, the car so close I could see the frost on the windows, and the next I was on the ground, my face buried in the snow. Something had slammed into me from behind, sending me sprawling, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I rolled onto my back, gasping, and saw it standing over me. Its face was inches from mine, the empty sockets of its eyes boring into me. The skin stretched across its skull was so thin I could see the bones beneath, and its breath was hot and rancid against my face. It reached for me, its fingers impossibly long and tipped with claws that glinted like ice. "Get away from him!" Mark's voice cut through the fog of terror, and I saw him charging toward us, the rusted poker in his hand. He swung it with all his strength, and the creature let out a guttural screech as the metal connected with its side. It recoiled, its limbs jerking unnaturally, and for a moment, I thought it might retreat. But then it turned its head toward Mark, its jaw unhinging in that awful, too-wide grin, and lunged. I don't remember how I got to the car. The next thing I knew, I was in the passenger seat, my hands shaking so badly I could barely close the door. Mark was behind the wheel, his face pale and streaked with blood, and the engine was roaring to life. The creature slammed into the side of the car just as we started to move, its claws raking against the metal. Mark floored the gas, and the tires spun for what felt like an eternity before finally catching. We shot forward, the creature disappearing into the trees behind us, and neither of us spoke until we reached the highway. Mark still has scars from that night, 3 long, jagged lines down his left arm where the thing's claws caught him. He doesn't like to talk about it, and I don't blame him. I've tried to tell myself that it wasn't real, that we were just sleep-deprived, that our minds were playing tricks on us. But deep down, I know better. I know it's still out there, somewhere in those woods, waiting. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear it, the faint sound of clicking just beyond the edge of the trees. We didn't stop driving until we hit the nearest town, a tiny cluster of buildings clinging to the edge of civilization. The gas station was open, its single fluorescent light flickering like it might give out at any second. Mark pulled into the lot and killed the engine, his hands still gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The car was silent except for the ticking of the cooling engine, but my ears still buzzed with the phantom sound of that awful clicking. "I'll call for help," I finally said, though my voice felt thin, like it wasn't mine. Mark didn't respond. He was staring straight ahead, his eyes fixed on the road we'd just come from. I followed his gaze, half expecting to see it standing there, waiting, but the street was empty. I stepped out of the car, the cold biting into my skin, and shuffled into the gas station. The fluorescent lights were painfully bright after the darkness of the woods, and the man behind the counter looked up with an expression of mild surprise. "You boys get lost?" he asked. I opened my mouth to respond, but I didn't know where to start. How do you explain something like that to a stranger? How do you make them believe you're not crazy? "We hit a deer," I lied finally. "Got shaken up a bit." The man nodded like he'd heard it all before. "Happens a lot out here. Damn things come out of nowhere." He handed me the phone without asking any more questions, and I called for a tow truck, though I knew we didn't need one. Mark wouldn't drive back to the cabin, and I wasn't about to argue. We spent the rest of the day at a cheap motel on the edge of town. Neither of us said much. The silence stretched long and uneasy, filled with unspoken questions we didn't know how to ask. That night, I dreamed of the forest. I was standing in the clearing again, the snow falling in thick, silent flakes. The air was still, the kind of heavy stillness that presses against your skin and makes it hard to breathe. I turned in a slow circle, searching for something, though I didn't know what. Then I saw it. It was standing at the edge of the trees, its skeletal frame blending with the shadows, its head tilted to one side, as if it were studying me, and the clicking started again. Soft at first, then louder, faster, until it filled the air like the rattling of dry bones. I woke up gasping, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. Mark was sitting in the chair by the window, staring out into the dark. "You heard it too," he said without looking at me. It wasn't a question. We left the next morning, driving south without saying goodbye to the town. Mark refused to talk about what happened, and I didn't push him. Part of me wanted to forget, to bury the memory so deep it couldn't hurt me anymore. But some things don't let you forget. A week after we got back, I started noticing strange things. Small things at first. A creak in the floorboards when I was home alone. The faint sound of snow crunching outside my window. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me. But then I found the scratches. They were on my bedroom door, 3 long, jagged lines that hadn't been there the night before. I stared at them for a long time, my breath fogging in the cold air. I hadn't opened that door since I'd gone to bed. That night, I dreamed of the forest again. This time, I wasn't alone. Mark was there, standing just a few feet away, his back to me. I called his name, but he didn't turn around. His shoulders were hunched, his head bowed, and when I stepped closer, I saw why. His face was wrong. His skin was stretched too tight over his bones, his eyes sunken and black. His jaw hung slack, and as he opened his mouth, the clicking started. I haven't spoken to Mark since that dream. He doesn't answer my calls, and I don't know if it's because he's trying to forget or because something has already happened to him. Sometimes, late at night, I hear it outside my window. The clicking, the crunch of snow. I don't know how it followed us or why it chose me. All I know is that it's still out there, waiting, and it's getting closer.